Okay, thank you everyone for joining us for part 2 of our series with the OU Kashrus experts. I'd like to thank again the OU, thank Rabbi Eli Elef, who coordinated this program. And today our guest speaker will be Rabbi Nachum Rabinowitz, whose Jacksonville connection is being a cousin of our very own Rabbi Meir Rabinowitz. But besides for that, he is a big expert in the production of wine and alcohol. And today we are privileged to have him give us a presentation on the different kashrus issues that come into the production of wine and alcohol. So wine and alcohol are obviously a very essential part of Jewish life, whether it's for Kiddush or for other special events to make l'chaim, with the Purim, obviously, or many other events of the year. So it's especially important for us to be educated on this important topic. And without further ado, I'll give the stage to Rabbi Nachum Rabinowitz.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Rabbi Cohen. Thank you, Rabbi Rabinowitz, Rabbi Meir Rabinowitz, my cousin, and Rabbi Stassler, who I know from past meetings we've had in both Washington State and work you've done for the OU. We appreciate that. I guess title, is this working? Let me see.
We're on. Yeah.
Here we go.
Got you.
Okay.
Yes.
Is it working?
Yes, it is. We see you.
Okay. So this is a shmooze, I'm told, about booze. We're going to talk a little bit about the kashrus of alcoholic beverages. And of course, we appreciate the Kyle in Jacksonville who have hosted us for this event. Now, here in New York, where I live, the governor, determined that there are certain essential businesses that even when the corona pandemic was in the beginning, he determined there were certain essential businesses. So something like a grocery store was considered essential. They were allowed to stay open in spite of the fact that other businesses were not. Pharmacies were also considered essential, but I think none of them were as essential and were allowed to stay open as much as liquor stores, because it was deemed that in order for us to survive this pandemic,
he's trying to get in. Why can't he get in?
we needed to get an ample supply of these beverages to get us through this period. So I think it's important. Just to correct Rabbi Cohen, he mentioned that I was an expert in the kosher manufacture of these beverages. Some would say that I'm an expert also in their consumption. Hopefully not too big of an expert.
You can get samples of this one.
Let's start with alcohol. So we'll talk about what is an alcoholic beverage. So the first thing is, how do you make alcohol? The first thing you need to start to make alcohol is something called sugar, because alcohol is a fermented conversion of sugar. And sugar becomes alcohol and CO2 with the addition of something called yeast. Now, sometimes this is naturally occurring yeast, such as with grapes. You have what's called wild yeast that actually grow on the skin of the grape and will cause, when you crush grapes into grape juice, they will automatically turn into wine, sometimes better, sometimes not so good. Many times with other types of beverages, they will have to add a laboratory-grown yeast in order to cultivate it and ferment it into alcohol. So that's the starting point. You always start with sugar. Now, in order to determine kashrus, I guess the first thing you need to know is, what does it come from? So let's look at some of the common sources of sugar. Common sources of sugar are something like cane sugar. In the South, cane sugar grows and it's refined and turned into the sugar that we pick up in our grocery stores. In the North, where the temperatures don't allow for the growth of cane sugar, they use beet sugar. And that's also a very commonly processed sugar. In Mexico, and some people look at this for the allegedly the low glycemic level of agave. And of course, that's also used in the making of alcoholic beverages. Honey is another source of sugar. Those come from bees. Grape is another popular source of sugar, not just used to make alcohol, but grape juice is a commonly used sweetener in industry. Apple juice is also
he told his father not to listen in.
I'm sorry? Okay, pear juice is another sweetener. And of course, there's maple syrup, which comes from the tree. But there's another type of sugar that we often consume all the time, but we may not be that familiar with it, and that's the cow's milk, because one of the components in milk is lactose, and anything which ends with O-S-E at the end is a sugar, like sucrose and glucose and fructose. Lactose is another type of sugar. It happens to be a sugar that many people have difficulty digesting properly. That's why, of course, lactose intolerance, but it's another source of sugar, and that may be relevant in our discussing the kashrus of various alcoholic beverages. Now, sugar is not the only source. Plain sugar or any of these types of sugar is not the only source. There's another step that can be added. You can take starch. Anybody who's using, let's say, a low-carb diet knows that basically you find carbs everywhere, right? You try to avoid them, but they seem to pop up in each and every place. The starch, which is found in many products, it's not a sugar per se, but those starches can be converted into sugar. That's unfortunately, that's what happens in our bodies. Many times the starches that we consume are converted into sugar in our bodies, and they convert into other unwanted girth that some of us are trying to avoid. But the way that it's done is you take a grain which has starch, you mill it, you grind it up, and then you put it into a mash tank, adding hot water, which activates enzymes that convert the starch into a sugar. So that's another source of sugar. So it's really an added step. You can start with plain sugar, or you can start with a starch converted into sugar, which then becomes alcohol. Now, in America, the most common source of starch and sugar is corn, all the way to our left. That's why in the United States, when you see standard ethanol, you can assume that it's probably not chametz, because the cheapest way for them to make alcohol today is with corn. In fact, I think there's some gasoline which has addition of ethanol, and that's typically is corn. It's, of course, the farmers industry have lobbied to have that done. It's probably done to bring them a little bit more parnasa. But there are other sources. Wheat, rye, barley, rice is a source of starch, oats are a source of starch, and potatoes are a source of starch. In fact, the traditional vodka from Poland was typically made from potatoes, not from wheat or corn as it is here in the United States. There's another additional one that I came across recently, which is called sorghum. Now, sorghum is a plant. I'm sorry? Okay. Sorghum is a plant that, interestingly, has both components. The top of the sorghum plant has grain, it has seeds, and those are milled often and made into porridge and made into like an oatmeal, a sorghum meal type of product. But the stalks themselves are very high in sugar. So this is actually something that you can take one of two ways, and the way you cultivate it will determine whether the stalk is more prominent or whether the grain head is going to be more prominent. What's interesting for us is that, think about Pesach. Of all of those which are listed here, there's only one which you would use in a Pesach alcohol, and that would be the potato alcohol. Because the others, corn is kitnius, unless you're, Sfardi who use corn and kitnius on Pesach. But the wheat, the barley, rye, and oats, actually rice is also kitnius, although some Sfardim avoid that on Pesach as well. Potatoes could be for Pesach. Now the sorghum, if you use the grain head, would be considered kitnius. If you use the stalk, it would not be considered kitnius, because the stalk is not a grain, it's not a seed, it's not a legume in any way. So these are sources of starch, and from these you would make sugar, which would then be converted into alcohol. Now, when you convert, what happens in a natural conversion process, you take your sugar and you add the yeast, and it converts the sugar into an alcohol. Now, typically, that yeast will convert as much sugar as available into alcohol. That's why, for example, when you make wine, you start out with a sweet grape juice, and you end up with a dry wine, which means non-sweet. It doesn't have sweetness. But what happens is, at a certain point, depending on the type of yeast which is used, and depending on the amount of sugar which is in the source material, it's going to stop. And the reason is that the yeast is a living organism. And like many other living organisms, bacteria, once alcohol reaches a certain level, it's going to sterilize it, and it's going to stop the yeast from producing. So what happens is when you make wine, it will go up to 12, 14, sometimes 15, 16% alcohol, and then it stops. Because what's happened is the alcohol level in the product is high enough that it kills the bacteria. So the yeast, which was converting, even if there's residual sugar, you can still have a sweeter wine because of that residual sugar that remains behind after. Sometimes everybody knows about Moscato, Bartenuer's Moscato drink, which is, I think, the most popular Moscato wine product in the United States. I'm not talking about just kosher products. I'm talking generally. That's the number one selling Moscato in the United States. And that's not just in the Jewish community. It's sold and very popular in other communities as well. Now that product, you'll notice, has only an alcohol level of about 5%, 6%. And the reason is that they stop. There would be more conversion and the alcohol would go higher like other wines, but they stop it because they want that residual. They want a low alcohol product and they want it to have that sweetness retained. Sometimes to make sweet wines, what you do is you allow the conversion, the yeast, to do its job completely, but then you'll add sweeteners afterwards. You can add sugar, you can add grape juice concentrate to sweeten the wine. And that's, most of the, let's say, Kedem sweet wines are not because of residual sugar from the original product. It's because there's added material, added sweetener afterwards, which may have halachic ramifications, but that's for a different presentation. But the question then is, when you make beer, you're going up to about 5% alcohol. When you make something like a malt, it's 7%. As you get into wine, it's about 12%, but then it stops. So how do you get liquor to be 40%? How do you get it to be 20%? How do you get those higher levels? So there's another step, which is called distillation. Now we all know from our chemistry days that alcohol has a different boiling point than does water or other materials. Distillation is essentially boiling. You're taking your alcohol, your beverage, which has alcohol in it, and what you do is you cook it to the level that the alcohol turns into a vapor, but the remainder does not. So what happens is your alcohol is turned into a vapor and then separated. It's shifted off. So you take that vapor and then you cool it. That's your ethanol. So you start with this mixture. It has, let's say, from grapes or whatever the material is, and may have 10% alcohol, 15% alcohol, 13, 12%. Typically, when you're making something like a bourbon or a scotch, you're only getting about 8, 9% alcohol from the original material. Then you distill it, and you usually go higher than what they actually sell you as a product. They're usually going to go, in the case of vodka, they go all the way up to 96%. 96% is the highest level of alcohol that alcohol can naturally be distilled until. It doesn't go higher than that. There are other methods you can actually get close to 100%. In fact, there were many who used to drink what they used to call Sechsundneunziger. Sechsundneunziger is an alcohol which is cooked to 96%. In fact, I think there was one old Jew who used to drink Sechsundneunziger, this 96% alcohol. He used to drink it every day after davening in the morning to wish, l'chaim to his friends in shul. And when he got older, he went to the doctor. He wasn't feeling well, and the doctor told him that he had water on his lungs. So he said, "I always knew," he says, that 4% was going to kill me. That's the 4%, of course, that didn't turn into alcohol. But that's the way distillation works, and that's how you get an alcohol level which is up to the 40% or 50%, depending on what your favorite drink is. Moving along, let's say talk about the way they used to make wine in ancient times. They used to bring grapes. The number one over here to your left is grapes, which are brought in baskets. Then they would put that into a large pit, and they used this interesting press. It's called bare feet, and they would crush the grapes by stomping on them. And if you notice, number 3 is like a small canal. And what happens is the liquid from this stomped grapes would flow down through this little canal into another pit, number 4, which is where you would create the must or the juice. which is separated. It's no longer with the peels, into the skins, or no longer with this, sometimes the seeds, but you created this. You would fill up number 5, these jugs, and they would ferment it into alcohol. Now, because there is this yeast which is naturally occurring in grapes, that's the way the Rabbi Nachum made grapes. They have this natural wild yeast. The wine would automatically ferment itself. After, it usually takes about a week to 2 weeks, maybe 3 weeks, that fermentation takes place. And then you actually have wine. Then there are additional steps. You want to filter it, you want to age it. Sometimes you want to put it into wood. So there are different steps which are additional steps. But basically, once the fermentation is complete, you have actual wine. That's the way wine was made historically. And today, modern winemaking is a little bit different, but it's the same principles. You harvest the grapes, you crush them, you ferment them, then you press them, you age them, you'll finish them, filter them, and you'll bottle them. That's how wine is made. Now, wine can be, and in many cases is, the source material for alcohol as well. When you're making something like rum, what you're doing is not starting with grapes, you're starting with sugar. Or when you refine sugar, one of the byproducts is called molasses. So they want to sell you the sugar, which you'll spend more money on. The molasses, which don't have that much of an application, are used in the manufacture of alcohol. And this could be from cane juice, cane syrup. It can be from really can be beet sugar as well, the same way. Again, fermentation, distillation, aging, mixing, and that's where your rum comes from. With tequila, it's a little bit different because you're starting with an agave. This is made down in Mexico. Tequila can only be made in one region of Mexico. Similar to tequila, agave products which are not made in that region are called mezcal. And they're also popular. Some like them even more than tequila. But tequila is made specifically in this region. They take the agave, which is a sweet plant. They actually make agave syrup, which is sold in stores as a sweetener. And you roast it, you add yeast to it. And that's agave, of course, would be eligible for Pesach, except that the yeast might not be for Pesach. So that's something to consider. I know many people say, well, what could possibly be objectionable about tequila for Pesach? It's made from agave and there's nothing else added. But actually, the yeast could be a problem. Also, many of it is aged, unless you like the blanco, which is the simple white tequila. If you like aged tequila, which is, let's say the anejo, which is an aged tequila, that could be aged in bourbon casks, be aged in casks that had chametz in them. So that could also be a problem. So this is how tequila would be made. And then, whiskey, it's similar, what you has that additional step, like I mentioned about the mashing. What you do is you start with the starch, you mash it, and you create sugar, you ferment it, distill it, you age it, and bottle it. And of course, the aging process is potentially the longest one. Some people will not buy a bottle of scotch unless it's 18 years old. They think it's not drinking age yet until it's 18 years old. That's a little bit above my budget. But I once went to I think it was a bar mitzvah, and the Baal Simcha was standing there with a bottle of like 18, maybe 20, 21-year-old schnapps. And he's pouring it for the guests. This was like a very expensive bottle. And, I went over and said, wished him mazel tov. And I said, it's so nice. I remember your son when he was just born. And now, can I know her? He's already 13 years old. Baal Simcha says, that's nothing. He says, this schnapps is 18 years old. He's only 13 years old. So we shouldn't get carried away in terms of how we celebrate our simchas and know what the real simcha is and what's just helps us along for the simcha. But there are clearly liquor which are not kosher and cannot be used. And that's the question is, does liquor need a hechsher? So for example, if you take a look from left to right, the Syrah is a very popular ultra premium vodka from France. It's made from grapes. So it's the same way you wouldn't touch wine, which is not kosher. You wouldn't touch this Syrah vodka either because it's not kosher. And it's basically wine which is then distilled into a vodka. It's distilled so that you don't even have the flavor of vodka left. Of the grapes left or of the wine left. But it is vodka, or mostly not. For example, grappa, which is on the right side over here. Grappa is a very popular Italian drink, which is made also from grapes, like the name grappa. And that's also something which is not kosher. Ouzo, which is a Greek product, or of course, there's cognac. Remy Martin makes a cognac, and not all cognac is aged until it turns that darker color. Some of it is actually blank. It may also be clear color, but it's extremely non-kosher. Something else to consider, while it may not be non-kosher, but there's something called vodka, which can be made from milk. There's a British vodka called Black Cow, and like the name, it comes from a cow. This is made from whey, and which is converted, the sugar is taken out, it's converted into alcohol, and that's your vodka product. They're from New Zealand, which has an abundance of dairy product, also makes vodka, and it does, I don't say it's that common, but it also can happen. So it's important to know when you pick up even just a liquor product, which you assume, it's just liquor, what could possibly be wrong with it? It may be something which is non-kosher, it may even be dairy, for that matter. If we move to, let's say, something like a blended whiskey. Now here's 3 examples of some of the more popular blended whiskeys from Canada. And I mentioned Canada specifically because we all know there's blended Scotch whiskeys and there's blended American whiskeys, but more specifically, Canadian products have been known to blend in not just, the different types of grain alcohols, but sometimes they'll also add wine alcohols. And this is something which was the source for a question which was posed by Rabbi Teitz from Elizabeth to Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. And the question that he asked there was, what's the halacha if they put in a small amount of grape into something like a grain alcohol? And I love this tshuva for a couple of reasons. I mean, Moshe writes what he writes, but what I like is the way his approach to the whole subject is like this. He talks about having a blended, it's a product that Rabbi Teitz had made with a Heksher Canadian blended whiskeys, which did not have any grape in them. But at the same time, he had given hashgacha. There were others that did have. So Moshe writes like this. He says, I personally am machmer not to drink such alcohol. Now, normally, when we are machmer, we try to make sure that everyone knows about our chumrah. That, if we're machmer chumrah, that should certainly be known by everybody that we know and come in contact with. But Ramosha writes like this: if I was in a shul and there was a simcha and someone was serving this type of an alcohol, he says, I would drink it. Because I don't want to show myself like a balgaiva. I don't want to show myself as being arrogant that I am avoiding it or others are drinking it. So if someone offers it to me, I will drink it because I believe halachically it is permitted. At the same time, personally, it's not the type of product that I'll go out and buy. It's not the product that I'll use in my personal life. Why is that? And the reason Rav Moshe writes in this tshuva, which is all here for you to read, is that the halacha is that wine becomes bottled, not like even other isurim which are bottled in 60 times, because anything which gives flavor, something which is asur, which gives flavor into something else, and assume that below 60, 1 in 60 will not give flavor, but above 1 in 60 will give flavor. So the halacha is that it's going to remain asur if you have more than 1 in 60. But since wine, the way it loses its name of being a wine. Once you blend it in 1 in 6, so it already loses its. So in this case, the amount of a grape material that was added to these Canadian blended whiskeys was below 1 in 60. It was usually 1 in 40. So Moshe says they're bottled. Since it's bottled, you can drink it. And he says, I would drink it if I was in a public context. I would drink it so as not to separate myself from the group. But the halacha, it would be mutter. And that would be the case as well. If you want to buy Canadian, again, I'm not telling you, not encouraging you to go and buy it. If you don't want to use it, certainly you can buy other products. It happens to be, I was in the factory that makes the Crown Royal, which is one of those that we had before. That's the one in the middle. That product uses grape, but it actually uses kosher grape. That's just, they add what's called the Canadian fortified wine, and they happen to be using kosher Canadian fortified wine. There, mashgichim will go to that plant. It's not under hashgacha, this particular product. They happen to know that it's using kosher. But if you like Canadian, you have whom to rely upon. This tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein. Again, if you don't want to, that's certainly that's admirable if you want to avoid it. Moving on to something like Scotch whiskey. So the OU certifies a product called Glenmorangie, which is one of the more popular scotches in the world. This product, which is the original, it's a 10-year-old product, does not contain anything with grape material. But more importantly, with Scotch, is that it's very frequent for them to use the barrels. What they do is they start the aging process typically with bourbon barrels, which are not a shiloh. And it will age like that for 5, 10, 20 years, whatever it may be. But what they'll do is, in order to distinguish the product and make it look special, or taste special, they will finish it. That means the last 6 months, the last 9 months, 12 months, they'll put it into former wine barrels. More specifically, sherry barrels or port barrels, sometimes Sauterne barrels. So these companies often make a simple product or their standard product without using sherry, but then they will add, for some of these more expensive products, specialty products. So for example, Glenmorangie also makes, if you can see it, various products. La Santa, which is matured in sherry casks for finishing. There's Quinta Ruban, which is in port casks. There's something called Nec de Vior, which is in Sauterne casks. And these, the OU will not certify. Does that mean the OU says that they're not kosher? I wouldn't say that. I would say that the OU won't certify, because when the OU certifies something, the expectation is that it's 100% kosher and not partially kosher, and not relying on bittul or anything like that. So again, I wouldn't be critical of anybody who drinks the stuff. I know in my own shul, what I recommend to people is that if they want to, they can bring these scotches which are in sherry or port or something like that. But at the same time, it's always advisable, bring at least 1 or 2 bottles of this. I mean, I say 1 or 2, I guess it depends what kind of kiddush you have. Some people make a kiddush, they have to have, multiple bottles, but at least bring 1 or 2 bottles of something which is l'chaladeus, which means without any question something, and certainly something with a hechsher, hopefully avoids all these issues. There is, let's say, a product called Tamantel, another company which I'm involved with, which is under the OU. So they make many iterations which are not with sherry. It's a company which is not that committed to sherry. They make 10, 16, 21. They also make a 15-year-old, which is in port. They don't have many. They even have like 32-year-old schnapps. But the 15-year-old, they use Kedem port barrels. Because what happens here is Tamantel is distributed in the United States by Kedem. And there's a relationship between the companies, and they have an OU on the product as a result. But the 15-year-old port product is aged, they ship over from the New York State winery of Kedem, these former port barrels, and they age it in those port barrels. So those have a hechsher, and they actually write on them kosher port wood. So that's something which is kosher. What's the halacha when you take something and you age it in a barrel which was used previously for wine? So the reason why we can be makel over here, because the fact is these barrels are usually pretty thick. It's thick wood, and if you would, the halacha is like this. If you take something, you put it into a utensil, and you leave it there for a period of time, it's going to take the absorption. It's going to take whatever blia, whatever was inside that barrel, and it's going to take it into your product. And typically with these thick barrels, you don't have 60 times in the content of the liquid which is inside against the thickness of the walls. However, the Shulchan Aruch says, when it comes to stam yayin, the halacha is that we say it's a kula which we have for wine. Remember that wine is today's asur midrabanan, because we're not talking about yayin nesech, which was used for pagan idol worship. We're talking about stam yayinim, which is we avoid it. We don't drink wine, but it's only asur midrabanan. As a result, it only asurs kedei klipa, which means it's only a very tiny film that goes into the wood. So we don't need to be concerned about the entire thickness of the wood. We're only concerned, and you certainly have shishim in the contents, in the liquid, opposite that kedei klipa, opposite that small amount of the barrel. So I think halachically, one is safe to say that. Now the question then, why do they do this? It actually adds flavor. Again, I'm not saying that one shouldn't be machmer. If one wants to be machmer, one should. We're not going to certify because we're relying on bittul is something we don't do. At the same time, halachically, I think one is in a good position to drink even something which is aged in wine. One of the reasons maybe to avoid it is this. What the Shulchan Aruch just mentioned about only asering kedei klipa, which means that the yayin only will aser the inside of the barrel, but not the entire thickness of the barrel. Many of those scotches and even bourbons today, even tequila today, which don't use standard wine barrels. They're using something like sherry, port, Madeira, Marsala. These are barrels which didn't just hold wine. Sherry is what's called a fortified wine. It's a wine which has added alcohol. So some argue that when does the Shulchan Aruch say that wine only ases kedei klipa? That's only with something like a standard wine, which goes up to 14%. But something like a sherry, which may go up to 20% as additional alcohol, maybe we wouldn't say that's one of the reasons of those who want to be machmer. There are other reasons to be machmer, but again, I think one can safely say, and certainly those who do use these products are not transgressing anything, because I think there's a very strong position that halachically it is permitted. Liqueurs always need to have a hechsher. And here are some just examples of liqueurs which are with hashgacha, at least here in the United States, all over the United States. But liqueurs, number one, the alcohol source could be grape. It could be dairy, potentially, not likely, but potentially. There are also cream liqueurs which have dairy, natural dairy in them. They have flavors. Now, here in America, I know in other parts of the world, nobody would drink a soda, or they call it the Midwest pop, or whatever you call it, wherever you're from. Nobody would drink a soda without a hechsher because of those flavors. And for the same reason, liqueurs certainly have those flavors and perhaps worse problems than that. There are also additives. They can add glycerin, which is a rounding agent. It makes the drink smoother, and that can be potentially traceable. So liqueurs certainly are not recommended without a hechsher. On the top right is just, I'll give them a plug. There's someone who came up with a product called Righteous 7. And this is a product which he takes all of the Shivas Haminim and he makes the liqueur out of all the Shivas Haminim. So it has everything in there. From the grains, the wheat and barley, to the grape, to the dates, to the figs, to the pomegranates, to olives. He's got everything in there. I'm not telling you whether you're going to like it or whether you can taste it, but that's a separate discussion. But it's just a product which is available out there. I think it's distributed by Kedem, and that's just also liqueur. But I know he's involved in making this product, and I can tell you, just along the way, there are a lot of detail that we had to go through in order to come up with a product which was 100% kosher. And without a hechsher, I would not recommend anybody to use a liqueur product. I think some of the CRC and the Star K have their liquor lists, and there they at least give you products which have a hechsher. The ones on the bottom over here do have a hechsher, the OU. And that's certainly the way you should go with liqueurs. Another issue when it comes to alcohol is chametz and Pesach. Yes, it's true in the United States, a lot of alcohol is made from corn, which is not a chametz problem. But a lot of it is not. A lot of it is made from wheat or other grains, certainly scotch, and we'll talk about bourbon in a moment. If you leave chametz in the possession of a Jew over Pesach, so besides being over on 2 lavin in the Torah because of that, you also have a problem that there's a knas to Rabbanan. Rabbanan said that if you leave chametz over Pesach and it wasn't sold, it wasn't disposed of properly, it becomes usher. And it's usher not just to consume, it's usher even to benefit from it. You need to have enough from it. And this is called a knas to Rabbanan for anybody who's over on Vayirod Bayimatzah. So some of the concerns here are many products. There's for some reason they say, a box of cereal after Lag Baimer, you're okay, no problems. Why? Because turnover in stores is so quick that that's not an issue. Liquor turnover is not that quick. Liquor is something that can stick around for a long time, and sometimes bigger sellers and smaller sellers. Also, you should be aware that a lot of people in the liquor industry are Jewish, and not all of them are so careful to sell their chametz. Also, many of them receive chametz on Pesach. So, when it comes to something like liquor, there's perhaps a greater concern than there is otherwise. But there is a big advantage that's coming to the fore. I'll get to that in a moment, but let's just talk about maybe some potential coolers. There's actually a fascinating steichemed What happened was, in the time of the Stei Chemed, there was a woman whose husband was in the liquor business, and basically their entire, all of their assets were tied into inventory of this product, which was derived from chametz. And he would make a mechiras chametz. He was, an Erlich Yid, would make a mechiras chametz each year. That person passed away. And this almana, without any children, she was now the owner of this alcohol in this business. And nobody told her about mechiras chametz. And what happened was, here she had her entire, all of their assets, whatever they had, was in chametz, and she didn't sell it. And the halacha was what to do in this situation. So there are a couple of things that are used, a couple of halachic tools which are used under certain circumstances, extenuating circumstances, to be mekel. One of them is, and this actually relates to bracha as well. We mentioned before that you make high level alcohol by distillation, which means all of the product, the finished product, has been distilled. It's been turned into a vapor. Now, what is vapor? Vapor is zeya in Hebrew. So since it's zeya, some would argue it loses its name of being chametz. It's, the Shulchan Aruch writes this, and it's based on a rivash, and he talks about it in the case of wine. And he says that if you have wine which went through this process, even if it was stam yenam and was asur b'hana, so we say that if it was derived from stam yenam, we say that it remains, actually from stam yain nesach, it's asur, because it's derived from something which is asur. But you see a distinction which is made. And on this basis, there's a Mishknas Yaakov Tshuva, where he writes, based on this rivash, that if you were to take chametz and you were to distill it, it would lose its name of being that product. And as an example, halachically, this is used, if you take something like cognac. Anybody likes cognac out there, or brandy? It starts off as wine, and they distill it until it turns into cognac or brandy. The bracha that we make on wine is bar kragafen. What bracha do you make on cognac? So most poskim say that you make a shahakol. And the reason you make a shahakol is, in spite of the fact that it started off as wine, it's not really the same wine anymore, it's zayah. And for a similar reason, under these extenuating circumstances, actually the Malbim actually wrote a similar piece to the Stei Chemed, and he also wanted to be mekel for this woman in that situation, because the product that she had in her inventory was not simple chametz, it was the zayah from chametz. And as a result, that, together with some other considerations, was a basis. And again, I'm not telling anybody to do this lechatchila. Certainly, if you keep your chametz over Pesach, you should certainly do a mechiras chametz, and that applies to schnapps as well. But for this reason also, there are some people who typically would not sell what we call chametz gomer, actual chametz, but they do, come on, you spent $150 on a bottle of schnapps, you're not just going to give it away. So many people are mekel to use mechiras chametz for that, and one of the reasons is this concept of zayah. There's another consideration, so I just mentioned another one, if it's of interest, which is in the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the brother of the Shulchan Aruch Harav, the brother of the Balatanya, wrote Hagois, and he writes there another consideration. What is chametz gomer? Chametz gomer is something that you would consume a kezayis in kedei achilas pras within a certain allotment time. Something which has such limited amount of chametz that you would never consume it in that quick period of time would not be considered chametz, which is asur because of chametz shavuot of Pesach. So he says, because schnapps is something that you don't drink, you sip it. Since it sips so slowly, it's not something that would be like that chametz, isur chametz, which would be taich kidei achilas pras. And as a result, that's another reason, and that was another additional sniff or an additional consideration to be mekel in those extenuating circumstances. Of course, what's relevant for us is, if we're trying to avoid chametz shavuot of Pesach, so we try to avoid companies that we know to be Jewish-owned or distributors that we know to be Jewish-owned that may have held this chametz. But the truth is, it's very hard to determine this because the distribution chains are very long, and where a product was at any given time. I know some of the liquor stores, if they are Jewish-owned, and many are, even if they're not necessarily observant, local Rabbanim will work out with them a system of mechiras chametz so that the kosher consumers can buy from them without a problem. But of course, it's limited in terms of how much you can address. You can only address one step in the chain. The chain may be a very long chain. Of course, if you have a liquor company that actually makes the liquor and ages it for years, and they don't do mechiras chametz and they're Jewish owned, that could be a certain problem. We'll get back to that. Now, what about bourbon? Now, bourbon by definition is something which is at least 51% corn. Oftentimes much more than that, usually 70%, maybe 80%, maybe 60%, but it's a minimum to be defined as bourbon. It has to have at least a majority of corn. Now, the rule is, when it comes to chametz shavar of Pesach, you have chametz, which was kept in Jewish possession over Pesach, so it becomes asur. But the Mishnah Berurah writes there that we can be makel, here we can be lenient and say chad b'trei batel, which means if you have a right, if you have a majority of non-chametz material, so that would be considered batel, and you could use such, even though it contains some chametz in it, you could use it after Pesach. So that would seemingly be a heter over here. There is a concern that Rav Belsky of the OU, Zechat Tzadik Levracha, had, was that when you have bourbon, what you're doing is you're mixing different types of grains. You're mixing corn with something like rye or something like wheat or something like malt, barley, and each one provides a different flavor. The only time we would say bittul b'roiv is when you have what's called min b'minon, when you have like flavored items. But when you have min b'she'ein mina, when you have things of different flavor, so if he says that if you have corn, it may be the majority, but if you also have rye, you would need shishin. It would not be enough to have rye. And that's why he was concerned about bourbon even after Pesach. Other poskim were not as concerned. They said alcohol is alcohol. The fact that it's derived from different grains, and yes, there are nuances in terms of the flavor profile. They were not as concerned as was Rav Belsky. One of the advantages we have today is that, like so many other big companies, they're what's called mergers and acquisitions. So that's really come into play in the liquor business as well. The largest liquor company, wine company in the world is Diageo. And here you have just some of the brands that they sell. There's actually some products of theirs which have a hechsher. But Diageo, since it's a publicly traded company, usually doesn't have these concerns for chametz shavar of Pesach. Another big company is Pernod Ricard, also with a lot of familiar brands, also something which is publicly traded, and the same is true of Beam Suntory, which again, a lot of familiar types of products which should not have a problem, at least at the point of the manufacture, would not have a problem of chametz shavar of Pesach, although perhaps later in the distribution chain, or certainly by the final store that you buy it from, there could potentially be a chametz shavar of Pesach problem. Two big bourbon companies, so happens that are Jewish owned and they're not publicly traded. One is called Heaven Hill Brands. That I know of for the last 20 years, they've been doing the mechiras chametz. So they're, in spite of the fact that they do make some products which are mostly rye and mostly chametz. Certainly bourbon, if you want to be machmer. Since they had a mechira, I would not say that their product should be a problem. They do a mechiras chametz, so Rava works it out with them. There's another Jewish-owned company by the name of Sazerac. And Sazerac, until very recently, has not done a mechira. And because you're dealing sometimes with products which are 7, 8, 10 or more years, Sazerac products, some would say, should be avoided. And I think the CRC list, for example, advises you to avoid Sazerac products, except for the ones that they specifically certify for this reason. But again, if you're dealing with something like bourbon, which is most of what they make, there are reasons to be makel, like I mentioned, because bourbon by definition is a mostly kitnius product, not a chametz product. So this is just another consideration for this. So the fact that we have conglomerate companies today has some pros and cons. The fact that it's non-Jewish ownership is a pro. But I'll tell you about some of the cons, and that is when you have to ship product from one country and all over the world, it's expensive to ship. And it's much cheaper and simple to ship product, let's say liquid, in a tank, and it is to bottle it and ship all the bottles. That's a lot of weight and a lot of extra bulk, and you can save a lot of money shipping. So what's happening now with these big conglomerates is that they have tremendous bottling facilities in certain locations, and the manufacturers where they still manufacture the products in the original locations where they swallowed up these companies, but they ship them. So number one, we have issues sometimes with tankers. And remember that alcohol is a davar charif. At least maybe makel, it's not like salted products, which are mamish davar charif, but this is, according to many places, is also davar charif. You don't even have to store something for 24 hours in a vessel in order to have a baliyah problem. Normally, with cold liquids, and alcohol is very rarely heated, it has to be stored in a vessel for 24 hours in order for there to be a problem. That's not the case over here because it's charif, because it's such a sharp product and high alcohol. As a result, there's some complications. For example, you may have a bourbon which is distilled in Kentucky, but if they're selling it in Europe, they're not going to bottle it in Kentucky. They'll ship a tanker filled with this bourbon to a bottling plant in Italy or Germany. They'll bottle it off there. Now, there can be all kinds of issues of common equipment that's used, number one, in the transport, and number two, in the bottling process. So it is a complicating matter. But the Eved, is it a problem? Perhaps not. But again, I'm just advising you of some of the things that, sometimes we have advantages with business changes, and sometimes we have further complications, something to be aware of. Now, when you have a product which is certified, obviously these considerations have been addressed. I'll just mention, when the OU certifies a product, let's say we certify a scotch or a bourbon, we're not certifying the distributor. We can't, because we don't even know who the distributor is. We certify the product as it leaves in a bottle from the bottling plant. We don't know who else was involved or what store you bought it by. That's why Cheerios, you need to be concerned, perhaps in the short period after Pesach, who was in that distribution chain and who is selling the finished product at the end. So this is something that people are concerned with after Pesach. Yes, misafek, there's reason to be makel. At the same time, with the alcohol, it's a little bit more complicated because it's not just a Lag BaOmer till Lag BaOmer problem. It can be a problem that can be a year-round problem. So I'm just advising you of that. To sum up, I hope I haven't gone over time, but just to sum up over here, conventional thinking is that flavored vodka should have a hashgacha. Flavored rum, like the spiced rums, should have a hashgacha. Liqueurs always must have a hashgacha. Brandy obviously needs hashgacha because without hashgacha, you can assume that it's not kosher. Beer, which is flavored, and this is a very common thing today, a lot of these flavored beers, a lot of these flavored mixers that are being sold today should have a hashgacha. And the other side, something which is an unflavored vodka, unless it's something like Ciroc or something like the milk derived, and usually you have an indication. If you see something which says that it's a grain-based vodka that's not flavored, it does not technically require hashgacha. By the way, vodka has an advantage. It's not an aged product; it's a fresh product. So it's usually made and sold in very quickly. So it's not something which sits around for a long time. Rum, which is unflavored, should not be a problem. They used to say dark rums may have been colored with grape. I don't think that's the case. Caramel color is much cheaper, and that's what they go-to for. We think many times a dark liquor is because it's aged in wood. That's true, but they also can add the caramel color to get the color up to uniform. Tequila typically does not need hashgacha. Yes, there are some tequila which is aged in like similar to scotch, which is aged. I'm sorry, I skipped the scotch, bourbon, whiskey. Also, technically, halachically, I don't think there's a problem. Tequila for the same reason, although scotch and tequila can be aged in wine casks or fortified wine casks. And of course, beer, which is unflavored, also typically does not need hashgacha. So that's really to sum up, and that's I think where my presentation ends. I hope I haven't gone past what you've allotted for, but I'd be happy if in the next few minutes, if there's any questions, I'd be happy to try to answer what I can.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you, Rabbi Rabinowitz, for this wonderful presentation. It was very, very educational and just helpful for us to understand. So there are a few questions here on the chat box I'm going to read out. someone asked here if the distilling process creates an issue of bishul akum.
No, and the reason is that bishul akum is something which relates to something which is ola shulchan aruch, something which would be served at a king's banquet. So a main dish, or even side dishes which are used, if you're cooking potatoes, you're cooking chicken, you're cooking fish, those are all covered by bishul akum. This is not something like that. This is just a drink. And although there was a discussion, I think, poskim about coffee, for the same reason, coffee which we all buy and use all the time, why is that not a bishul akum? And coffee is something which is, respectable. People will invite people over to partake in a coffee, but because there's water involved, and also because of the zeh concept, this is not something which is a bishul akum issue.
Okay. Another question is, someone's asking if there is any. Are there any certified? Are the liquors or vodkas or things that don't have OU certification? Are there any of them that are actually certified and just don't have the symbol on them, or are those things that are just widely accepted without hashgacha?
So there are, vodka is actually one segment of the industry that's embraced kosher a lot, like even big companies like Stolichnaya and Absolute and Belvedere have taken, or Smirnoff, for example, doesn't have the OU, it has the KSA hashgacha. So a lot of the big name vodkas have hashgacha, but I think many people buy them even without hashgacha. Again, I'm not faulting somebody. Some people, I know, I think the Starkey has a policy for their liquor list to use only domestic vodkas, not the foreign vodkas. I don't think this should be that distinction, frankly. But again, listen, when you buy something with a hechsher, certainly what's in it. They can use glycerin in vodka also. It can happen. Not usually the better ones, but I've seen it in Russia where they use glycerin. So there's a lot of things that can happen. So some people, specifically want to look for. I commend them for that because it's only with the demand that the consumer makes that companies actually come. Many times we talk to Scotch companies and they say, like, well, why don't you get a hechsher? You could get a hechsher, and they say, our best customers are Orthodox Jews. They're not interested. So I would say, if people want a hechsher, the reason that people buy and companies become kosher is because there's a demand for it. So I definitely encourage people to look for things with a hechsher. But at the same time, I wouldn't fault anybody for buying a grain vodka product which is not with a hechsher.
Right, but just to clarify, any item that is certified, that is supervised by the OU has the symbol on the bottle?
What happens with some of the, especially in the liquor industry, but it's not just liquor industry, many companies use the OU only for them in products which is sold here in the US. So for example, a Scotch product, which is under the OU, you buy that product here in the US, will have, if you go into a duty-free shop, which is a different distribution chain altogether, those will probably not have the OU on it. If you purchase product in Europe or elsewhere, it's probably not going to have the OU on it. Simply, the companies have decided not to go that route. Typically, again, it's worthwhile, like, especially I mentioned that there's a lot of shipping going on, and there's a lot of product which is being bottled off in different countries. It's kedai to, there are some liquor lists out there, and you can check and see what those lists mention. Typically, I would say that the product which is under hechsher is usually okay anywhere you buy it, but I wouldn't guarantee it necessarily.
Right.
So, tread with a little caution.
Okay, so one other question is, I guess this is a popular question on what you mentioned about sherry casks in whiskey, is if it's Avidi Lataima, I mean, the reason the distilleries specifically use wine cask is because it does add flavoring. Why does that not take away any bittul or any other reasons for it to be permitted?
So the reason for that is the kula of wine is that even if it does provide flavor, we need not be considered or concerned with it except for kedei klipa. You're right. Technically, there may be a taste which is imparted from again, I've heard, if you want to talk about flavor, from the flavor analysis, many of the distillers in Scotland will tell you that the wine is not actually doing anything for the Scotch. What's happened is that the cask, wood, does something for the Scotch, and the wood has certain maybe negative characteristics that by having had sherry aged in it for periods of time, it nullifies those problems. So many would say it's not actually a time of wine. It's just that the wood that has been used for sherry or port is a better one for Scotch. Again, I'm not saying that's halachically necessarily a valid statement and to rely on that. But what we're relying on is that if you have it, it's a kula. The kula is stam yain is not as chomer as other isurim, and since it's not as chomer as other isurim, so we can be mekel. We can be mekel, number one, because 1 and 6 is buckle. There's certainly, if it's 1 and 6, it's certainly imparting flavor. But the fact is, I can ignore it. Halachically, I'm allowed to ignore it. Furthermore, some would say that wine, when it's mixed with other liquids, doesn't really enhance it. So since it doesn't enhance it, we can ignore it. So there are different, there's different, the halachic rationale for it. We probably can go into a lot of detail about this, and I'm not even qualified necessarily to speak to that. But there are certain halachic principles and applied to wine allow us to be naked.
Mm-hmm. Okay, one more.
There's some reasons to be machmer also, but I'm just telling you halachically there's a very strong position to say that one can.
Okay, someone else asked a question. This is maybe just on a question on the OU policy in general. Maybe Rabbi Elif could share some insight on that. Is how come the OU doesn't publicize a list of recommended items or products?
Rabbi Elif, you want to answer?
It's really from a liability and legality standpoint. I'll give you an example. There's a very popular product out there which does not have hashgacha. And we actually approached them about getting hashgacha, and they said, "Oh, we don't need to be kosher because we're on a list." And they sent us a link to one of the other hashgachas out there that had that list, and sure enough, they're there. So they view that as a de facto certification. So one is, if we start telling people we're putting lists of things that we don't certify, then we've kicked ourselves in the back, because what difference is that between that and we certify? Additionally, things change. Just because you're on a list today doesn't mean that you could be on that list tomorrow. And without constantly monitoring it, there's no way to know what's going on. So as a general rule, we don't like to make statements about other products if we're not certifying them. Because again, there's different nuances. You can make blanket statements. You could say, like Rabbi Rabinowitz was talking about, in general, a whiskey or something like that might not require hashgacha, but when you start going to specific products, now you're saying, well, we're guaranteeing what's going on in that facility. Do we know? We've never been there. So how can we actually say that? For example, give you another example of a case where it might be an issue. Everyone's familiar with Guinness. Rabbi Rabinowitz, did you speak about Guinness at all?
I didn't.
So for those that are big beer drinkers and they like a certain, have of Irish descent, they really appreciate a good stout Guinness in probably one of those nice mugs, those beer steins that they serve as well. And Rabbi Rabinowitz, that does look like a Guinness. And one of the things, they actually try getting hashgacha. The problem is that part of the recipe includes using isoglass as a clarifying agent. And isoglass is derived from porcine, meaning it comes from pork. So as hashgacha, we can't give hashgacha for it. We can't take responsibility for it. From a kashrus perspective, it's not such an issue because of the fact that it's batul b'shishim. But again, as hashgacha, we can't rely upon bittul. So we run into those issues as well.
We've come a long way here in America. In Europe, it's very common. I do a lot of work in Europe. There are a lot of lists, and not just for liquor, for a lot of products, for cereals and for beverages and all kinds of things. And oftentimes the list is created on the basis of a phone call. They call a company, they ask them a few questions, and on that basis, it gets onto a list. Trust me, the lists that are out there, and again, I'm not, I think they do serve a purpose, but I'm not a big fan of them. And the reason I'm not such a big fan of it is because it's not hashgacha. It's not the same thing as doing real verified work, where the contracts are signed and commitments are made and there's follow up and monitoring. So it's a different type of thing. So the OU has not created lists, and we're hopeful that we, as time goes by, as the demand increases, which it has, and more companies are interested in having kosher liquor, that, if you want to ask me for a recommendation, I'll give you my gut recommendation based on my experience. But we'd rather, if you really are serious about this, then buy something with a hefsher.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Rabbi Bennett, and thank you, Rabbi Elif, as well. Really looking forward to next week. Thank you for your time. Thank you, everyone else who participated. This was really, really eye-opening. And as a second part of our 3-part series, this was great to know about the whole world of alcohol. And thank you to the OU for providing this service to the community to educate us more about Kashrus.
L'chaim.
Thank you all. L'chaim, l'chaim.